Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 20 of Series 10. The question for today is there a self, or are we just bundles of thoughts, feelings and memories and values? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 1. The question, is there a self, raises many issues. Not least is the definition of this self. Yet the notion of the self also implies the idea of an essential centre or character of human existence. For this reason, the notion of the self is related to the idea of mind or consciousness, and in this way the notion of the self is involved in the question of human existence. The question of the self then raises many issues, many of which we don't have time to discuss in depth. These include justifying the centrality of the self in the amalgam of states that is human existence, and how is the self different from self-consciousness and personal identity. With respect to the question, is there a self, the idea that we have or ourselves is intuitively very compelling. But this intuition isn't sufficient evidence that a self exists, but it puts the onus on disproving it. That is, there is a strong prima facie case that there is a self, like other facts that consciousness exists, other people are conscious, and that the external world exists. So there is a strong prima facie case that the self exists that I will develop extensively here. That is, I can say that I am conscious of myself in this body at this time and place through a timeline. But some philosophers like Hume, Dennett, Metzinger and Strawson deny the existence of a self. Yet it's notable that these philosophers are also sceptical about consciousness. And in my view, the neglect of consciousness is a primary reason for the denial of a self. But as issues concerning the self are often made in the form of pre-suppositional assertions, I must insist that arguments against the self define exactly what they mean by the self. A definition is essential in order to know what we are arguing for and against. And realistic definitions will also exclude illegitimate and implausible arguments. So we must first consider some inadequate and not so adequate conceptions of the self. For the sake of completeness, we should start with the outdated ideas of the self as a ghost, spirit or soul. Another inadequate definition of the self is as a homunculus, or a de facto second person inside my head. Yet we should also consider more sophisticated notions of the self that are also non-starters. We can start with the idea of the self as a transcendental consciousness in addition to my mental states. But there is no transcendental consciousness hovering above what a person is. So transcendental consciousness isn't a candidate self for either side of the debate. This error can be clarified by another that Gilbert Ryle called a category mistake. For example, an apple might be said to have properties like taste, colour, shape, and that it exists. Yet the apple's existence isn't another property, but it is constituted by its other features. And the same mistake is often made in the case of human existence or consciousness. That is, the self or human essence is thought to exist in addition to human experience. But the self need not be any more than all the states that constitute what we are. The idea of a metaphysical essence might then provide a conception of the self that could be affirmed or denied. But establishing, defining and showing that such an essence is the self is an intractable problem. Sartre's existence precedes essence, for example, indicate some of the problems of this endeavour, and Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning solidifies this failure of essences. Then there are other definitions of the self that do contribute to the identity of the self, but aren't adequate in themselves. These include my body, that gives me spatial identity, but I'm a conscious being, not just a body. I also have a name, a date of birth, a nationality, a race and profession. But I am more than these things. Self-identity is also sometimes determined by the sum of my memories. But again, I am more than my memories that can be lost. Yet Thomas Metzinger defines the self as a misrepresentation that proved to be functionally adequate. That is, it's a fiction that does not exist, but we'll get back to Metzinger later. But the non-existent fiction argument is defeated by the fact of a phenomenon that is a self. So saving that argument for later, none of the above serve as an adequate concept of the self, so we needn't argue for or against any of them as instantiations of the self. But I might identify myself as a conscious being, or as a reflectively conscious being, or as a being having a phenomenal self-consciousness. Barry Dainton, for instance, contrasts the psychological self of memories and beliefs to the phenomenal self, which may or may not survive a Star Trek style teleportation, as in his thought experiment. But such ideas are already beginning to present viable conceptions of what might legitimately be called a self. That is, I am conscious of being in one space, focused by my brain and body on one perceptible timeline. That is, I don't have perceptions here and feelings over there. They are centered around myself, and they are all experienced by the same conscious being, myself. So we should now start to examine the arguments against such conceptions of self. The first classical argument against the self can be found in David Hume. He writes, I never can catch myself without a perception, without which I may truly be said not to exist. But Hume contradictorily refers to his self as I repeatedly in time while making this point. And repeated references to oneself over time is an argument for the existence of a self. Yet he also seems to think of himself as another object in his field of perception, whereas he is the originator of his field of perception, like an eye that cannot see itself. So he shouldn't even be looking for himself like an object amongst other objects. And any such self would be a much more nebulous kind of entity. But Hume also argues that the self cannot be found because it is a bundle of sensations that he calls, or is called, a bundle man. He writes that I may venture to affirm that selves that are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement, unquote. But I don't think that just a bundle of sensations could have the unities of perception that we have already outlined. Neither could it gather itself together in the way that Hume does to report on itself as such a bundle. Yet we still have to examine the views of others who share this disjointed notion of consciousness. But this disjointed view that lacks a self can be explained by a neglect of consciousness noted earlier. That is, the amorphous and amalgamated character of consciousness means that it is constituted by multiple states. And it also should not be perceived as a single object amongst other objects. Hume is, of course, an empiricist critic of metaphysics and of the unexplained, who has debunked many assumptions. He is known for both his is-ought constraint and the distinction between relations of ideas and empirical facts. He is also famous for criticizing religion and metaphysics by saying that, does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it contained nothing but sophistry and illusion. Unquote. Hume's sceptical empiricism is rewarding when it is directed towards sophistry and illusion, but it comes adrift when applied to areas less amenable to evidence and proof, such as the phenomenon of consciousness that the good will is good and the final status of causality. Yet like Hume, Metzinger, Strawson and Dennett all use the idea of multiple selves to argue against the self. It's notable that Dennett's claim that there is no such thing as the self also includes a skepticism about consciousness. This is a theme that we can pursue further here. But Dennett is ambiguous about his denial of consciousness, possibly to allow himself plausible deniability. Yet his many statements like the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon reveal that Dennett is a physicalist who denies the distinct reality of consciousness. Dennett argues against the ideas of consciousness and the self with the notions of mems and multiple draft theory. A mem is a broad culturally or genetically transmitted idea at work within and between human minds, and that mems enable multiple drafts of the self and consciousness which only have notional existences. But multiple draft theory implies a cognitivist theory of self and consciousness that we need not accept. And when Daniel Hutto poses this problem in the form that animal and infant selves or consciousness cannot be explained by MEMS and multiple draft theory, then it responds with feigned skepticism about animal and infant consciousness. Yet Dennett attempts to further explain the non-existence of the self by comparing it to a centre of gravity. He writes that a centre of gravity has no physical properties at all, except for spatial temporal location. It is a purely abstract object. It is, if you like, a theorist's fiction. It is not one of the real things in the universe in addition to the atoms. Unquote. Yet without being pedantic, Dennett is wrong to say that a centre of gravity is a purely abstract object. This is because an abstract object has no physical properties, like numbers are abstract through and through. But gravity is not an abstraction of something, it is a physical force like magnetism or light. Yet Dennett insists and states that the self or the soul is really just an abstraction. This use of the word abstraction isn't just a terminological matter. It also reveals Dennett's scientific materialism, seen in his view that the most disqualifying feature of dualism is its fundamentally anti-scientific stance. And he similarly says that, unlike atoms, gravity is not one of the real things in the universe. Given this kind of criterion of what is real, we can see why Dennett thinks the self isn't real. Yet we can now return to the multiple selves argument against the self used by Hume, Dennett and Strawson. Galen and Strawson also believed in multiple selves, but multiple selves at different points in time. But it also relates Strawson's view to another erroneous account of consciousness. We can first note Strawson's belief in panpsychism. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is everywhere and in everything. To defend this view, Strawson argues that as mind exists, and as it can't be produced from non-mind, then it must already exist everywhere and in everything. But just because it hasn't been explained how mind is produced from non-mind, this doesn't mean it hasn't happened. And strong evidence that it has happened is that mind or consciousness manifestly exists. Yet there are even stronger arguments against panpsychism. For instance, mind or consciousness must at least have the properties of cognition and sentience. But these properties do not exist in everything and aren't everywhere in the world. So I regard panpsychism as an indication of confusion and a misunderstanding of consciousness and of the self. John Searle goes on to call some outcomes of panpsychism absurd, and I agree that it is seriously flawed. But let's look at some arguments for and against multiple selves at different points in time. These can involve quantum packages of time, phenomenal experience, and memory. But most fundamentally, modern physics views time in quantum packets, in discrete units or quanta. This compares remarkably with Hume's view of different perceptions which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity, quoted earlier. But this doesn't mean that these quanta of time are not part of an overarching self. That is, like when the different frames of a movie become one coherent film. Joining these moments, William Stern gives us an extended specious presence developed by Barry Dainton. William James also extends moments in time as a saddleback or a duration with a bow and a stern. And James further regarded mind as a diverse but unique stream of consciousness. The specious present has also been thought of as a construction of an experience through time. The physicist Carlo Rovello sees in the perception of music single notes transformed into a tune by the mind. He reasons that the flow of time likewise anticipates events in the future based on events in the past. These perceptions of past, present and future and music are further arguments for a self. Another argument for connecting moments in time with others was made by Paul Grice's concept of overlap. That is, each temporary state contains an element or remembered experience shared by the preceding state. And for Grice, that continuity through overlapping states secures our continuity as a self. Yet the next step up from quantum packages of time as selves is the idea of particular thoughts as selves. The idea that each thought is a self isn't plausible, but it leads to ideas of thoughts in time or memories. And memory has long been regarded as a determinant of an individual self. That is, I can remember my experiences and what I did last week, last year, and in my childhood. And these memories are linked together in a coherent history in a single timeline by my awareness of them. John Locke was very impressed by the role of memory in forming a coherent and unified self. But as Locke admitted, this continuity of memory is vulnerable to error and to forgetting things. And did my infant memories really happen, or did I construct them? Maybe, but my memories of last week aren't the same as my infant memories. But the clearest examples of the memory in question, of the self, is found in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Such memory loss can lead to confusion, personality changes, and the inability to perform basic tasks. The most well-known example of this is of the British musicologist Clive Waring, and due to his amnesia he had to reintroduce himself to his wife many times a day. But on Barry Dainton's account, it can be argued that the phenomenal self remains the same, even though the psychological self and memories and beliefs have been lost. Yet the idea of a phenomenal self may seem implausible to some people, even when linked to the fact of consciousness and explanations of its neglect. But the idea and very real practice of moral responsibility reinforces this concept of the phenomenal self. That is, should people be held responsible for crimes committed decades ago, but now long forgotten? For example, a former Nazi SS soldier who helped kill more than 300 people in Italy in 1944 wasn't prosecuted because he had dementia and was unfit to stand trial. But was he morally and legally responsible for his crimes for the rest of his life? I think so. But the idea of a phenomenal self can nevertheless be used in an argument against the existence of a continuous self. That is, Dennett considers the idea of a phenomenal self with the fictional idea of teleportation. In this scenario, people believe themselves to be the same person as their psychological selves. But Dennett and others suspect that teleportation would be a form of suicide, and that this would reveal a discontinuity of even the phenomenal self. But Dennett is performing a thought experiment of something that almost certainly will never happen. And conversely, the phenomenal self then becomes a strong argument for the continuity of a self. This is especially the case because an unfamiliarity with the idea of a phenomenal self is an indication of a widespread unfamiliarity with the idea of consciousness that I have associated above with the denial of the idea of a self. But another question about the continuity of the self is about when this continuity is broken, as in sleep. In such cases, the idea of continuity needs to be qualified because it doesn't mean unbroken. Continuity here means the same phenomenal self appears after being disrupted by sleep. Yet in the above case of teleportation, the identity of the self is in question, but that is an extreme case that is never likely to happen. And in the case of sleep, neurological activity continues in the same body through a traceable time and place. But interesting thought experiments have considered teleportation producing two identical selves. Yet the fission of consciousness, as also in split brain experiments, does not impugn continuity. That is, the timeline of the self can be broken if there is a continuity of the same self. Yet finally, in his work Being No One, Thomas Metzinger claims that no one ever was or had a self. That is, all that ever existed were conscious self-models that could not be recognized as models. And these models are just things that we construct, and the phenomenal self is not a thing but a process. But firstly, it's a mistake of elementary theory to think that the phenomenal self is a thing rather than a process. And consciousness can indeed be a process and still provide a conception of a continuous self. Yet Metzinger's constructed self-models are also similar to Dennett's MEMS as temporary multiple selves, as well as similar to Strawson's self as just a succession of mental events and experiences. So many of the arguments against Dennett and Strawson also hold against Metzinger. We saw earlier, for example, that Dennett's multiple draft theory of the self or consciousness ran into problems. That is, it assumes a cognitivist theory of self and consciousness that can't explain either self or consciousness. Then it argues against the idea of consciousness and the self with the notions of MEMS and multiple draft theory. A MEM is a broad culturally or genetically transmitted idea at work within and between human minds. and that MEMS enable multiple drafts of the self and consciousness which can only have notional existences. As well as that, Daniel Hutto holds that animal and infant selves or consciousness can't be explained by MEMS and multiple draft theory. But Metzinger takes these problems further when he says that fish just might have a phenomenal self-model. And he goes on to say that a phenomenal self-model is a necessary condition of suffering. But I can't see how either of these things can be true. Firstly, a phenomenal self-model needs two things, a phenomenal self and a model. Now, a phenomenal self might just be defined as a property of either animal consciousness or reflective human consciousness. I take it that the phenomenal self is a property of reflective human consciousness. But even if it is a property of fish, it is to an exceedingly minimal degree. Not to do so seems not to understand the graduated nature of consciousness. Also, and secondly, a phenomenal self-model is a model which requires an abstract conception of the self, but animals don't have powers of abstraction, and fish are unlikely to have an abstract conception of the self. And thirdly, animals don't suffer because they have a phenomenal self-model that is supposedly disrupted. Animals suffer because they are conscious creatures which have affective experiences. To explain animal suffering in terms of phenomenal self-models is an extreme cognitive bias. Yet I also want to get to Metzinger's negative argument that the self is a functionally adequate misrepresentation like a colour and a fiction that does not exist. Yet this is a largely functional and evolutionary argument that depends on the plausibility of its theory, and many theories have been unseated by inconvenient facts. The inconvenient fact in this case is phenomenal consciousness that is a self. So for these reasons of explaining consciousness and the self functionally and with a phenomenal self model that is cognitive, precondition of animal suffering that involves abstraction, I cannot accept Metzinger's arguments against the existence of a self, and instead I take them as further examples of confusion about the nature of consciousness. One difficult issue raised by Metzinger and others is that we have mistaken models or constructs for a self. This issue has some merit because both the self and consciousness has serious problems of obfuscation. But this obfuscation doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a self that can be apprehended. There are many reasons why consciousness, and thereby the self, has been overlooked in ancient and the modern world. To start with, we lack both concepts and a rich language of mind and consciousness. And unlike physical objects, mind is amorphous, transparent and unquantifiable. But as recognized by Husserl and others, there are deeper structural reasons for the obscurity of consciousness. One of these is what we can call the non-referentiality of self-consciousness. That is, normally when we perceive objects, we invariably perceive them in contrast to others, like a black spot on a white board. But self-consciousness cannot apprehend other conscious beings in the same way as it apprehends itself. This results in an epistemological impediment that hinders the apprehension of consciousness. And in my view, this has radically obscured the idea of consciousness in academia and in common thought. But these aren't the only positive and negative arguments for the existence of a self that we can add to now. Another explanative argument is of the divisibility of mind, which needn't imply a divided self. The most obvious is modern neurological specialization of different parts of the brain as the foundation of mind. One way to respond is to cite a known plasticity, that areas of the brain can adapt to new functions. But more strongly, the brain is not the mind, which is greater than the sum of its neurological parts. Another account of the division of mind itself is found in Jerry Fodor's modular model of mind. On this view, the mind is divided in various ways, vertically, horizontally, and typologically. For example, as cognition, affect, and will, or reflective consciousness, and the unconscious. But this view does not deny the continuity of these different forms of consciousness. Yet, just as a matter of course, postmodernists do reject any coherent concept or entity as the mind or consciousness. Gilles Deleuze, for example, describes individuality as differential, forever dividing itself and changing. Deleuze postulates multiple faculties giving rise to feeling, thought and action. But postmodernists like Deleuze and Richard Rorty have physicalist inclinations, and in rejecting the idea of consciousness, they automatically reject any features like the continuity of the self. Yet paradoxically, postmodernists are more interested in making claims about mind that they can use as tools for destabilizing conventional thought and understanding. So I see postmodernists as excluding themselves from the question of the self. Yet central to the question of the self is the debate about personal identity and the identity of objects. For example, is the identity of objects determined by constituents, function, locus in time and space, or other properties? With respect to the identity of a self, Saul Kripke is well known for his argument against physicalism that self-consciousness is an a priori recognition of personal identity that is indubitable. Kripke holds that it is absurd that the identities of minds might not be discovered. This is because the awareness of that identity is essential to its existence. That is, Kripke argues against physicalism by distinguishing personal identity as a property of consciousness. Personal identity isn't attributable to the physical world, and it is discovered by a priori awareness. But physical identities are discovered contingently in an a posteriori fashion. Kripke clarifies his view with the concept of rigid and non-rigid designators. A rigid designator, as the name Clark Kent, designates the same object in all possible worlds. But a non-rigid designator, as the mild-mannered reporter, need not designate the same object. Kripke focuses on the rigidly designated property of personal identity. This distinguishes a unique aspect of consciousness differentiated from physicality. The point here is that Kripke defines the personal identity of the self as an indubitable a priori, and that this indubitable a priori is an aspect of consciousness that is nevertheless often obfuscated. Despite all the above, there are other arguments for a self, some of which we can quickly run through. These are basically about the coherence, unity and continuity of the self over time. There is firstly what we can call the social scaffolding of the self that consists of our rights, duties, values and beliefs that we share with others in free association as well as in institutions. These may change, but around a median to which a self is attached. Another is the internal coherence and unity of the self at a moment in time. That is, our cognitive and affective experiences are brought together when appreciating nature or performing a skill like driving or analysing a piece of writing. Then there's the internal coherence and unity of the self over a period of time. That is, we remember our actions and plans in the past and look forward to events in the future. Another important element of the self is our agency, or our ability to do things and to change outcomes. That is, we can order our lives and the world around us and do things in the present that affect our future. Finally, the first mediator of our agency is our body and our bodily needs. Yet the body is also a source of both the external and internal coherence of the self. That is, my body stays with me continuously while other features come and go. And of course, I am focused by my body that draws together all my experiences. These are a few of the ways in which a self has coherence and continuity in addition to all the others listed above. So my conclusion is that a self does exist as a phenomenal consciousness present in numerous ways, and that the denial of the self is largely a result of a neglect and obfuscation of consciousness. But in order to reach that conclusion, it was essential to define what the self could be, so that we could know what was being denied as well as what we are arguing for. We saw that ideas of the self as a ghost, spirit, soul, homunculus, a transcendental consciousness, or as an essence, or even as a functionally adequate fiction weren't adequate. Other features were able to contribute to the identity of a self, but weren't adequate in themselves, such as my body, my memories, society, agency, and even space and time. But as a reflectively conscious being with a phenomenal self-consciousness, I do have a self. This definition of a self meets our requirements of continuously existing as the same entity. And this definition also explains why the self and consciousness are rejected at the same time. We saw that Hume was sceptical about consciousness and thought of himself as another object of his perception. Dennett's multiple draft theory made cognitivist assumptions as well as adhering to scientific materialism. Strawson's multiple selves omitted how they could be joined, again under the influence of an unsatisfactory panpsychist theory of consciousness. And many of these arguments were also applicable to Metzinger. Yet given phenomenal consciousness serves as an adequate concept of self, how could there be these denials? One reason is a committal to a definition of the self that is either obscure or can never be satisfied. Another is a sheer lack of perception and a refusal to admit to facts contrary to certain premises. A prime example of this is the denial of consciousness related to the denial of a self. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.